Nature is war. One of the fundamental differences and disagreements and distinctions between the right and the left is the portrayal of man in the state of nature. Is man this sort of peaceful and amicable being, or is he warlike and violent? Some of the thinkers that right away come to mind when I think about this question are Rousseau and Hobbes. Both of them sort of lived around the same period. Rousseau is a major figure of the French Revolution in a lot of ways, and also a great contributor to sort of the modern leftist, even Marxist thought. Whereas Hobbes is very much a statist. And when I say statist, he believed in the authority of the state and its necessity to sort of quell the natural violence and aggression in man. Rousseau was the opposite. He saw man in the state of nature as living at the height of his ability to attain happiness and satisfaction. Rousseau believed that in the state of nature, man was healthier, that he lived longer, that his bone structure was stronger, and one of the reasons for believing this is before the agricultural revolution, subsisting on dairy and meat compared to grain does have these sort of health benefits when food is fresh and organic and not processed, which is the sort of phenomena that begins with the agricultural revolution, is the slow processing of food over time. And like I said, Hobbes doesn't buy this. While Rousseau would say in the state of nature, man does not wage war because he has no need to wage war, because culture is ultimately what corrupts man into waging war. This is Rousseau's belief, that without culture, without these sort of artificial hierarchies that Marx talks about, without the sort of need for property, for example, or the need for possessions, there is no war. And Hobbes completely disagrees with this, as do I. Hobbes believes that in the state of nature, man is violent, man is savage, and man is warlike. And I tend to believe this. And Hobbes believes that the only way to quell the violence in man is through customs such as culture, such as the state, such as law. And he drafts up this thing called the Leviathan. And the Leviathan is essentially an allegory to a sea monster, I believe. And he sees the state as the Leviathan. The state is the power that ensures that the people abide the law. Of course, culture does this to a large degree. It's sort of the invisible law. It's not written in code, but people follow it. So you have high trust cultures, for example, like Japan. And you can generally live in Japan without really needing to follow the laws, because naturally you've been brought up a certain way and you've been brought up to sort of value specific things, specific actions, specific ways to function in a social setting. Now, Hobbes' Leviathan, however, especially when you start to get multicultural societies and you have differences in values. For example, in Europe today, there is a big difference between the Islamic immigrants that are coming into Europe in places such as France, Germany, and England, and the native population, which is either secular or traditionally Christian. And you have a lot of disagreement between them, and that's where law comes into play. For Hobbes, there is no real human right, the same way, or in opposition to how Rousseau sort of not necessarily believes in a right, but believes in the natural setting, humans just live as they should. Hobbes doesn't buy this. He sees, as sort of realists see, that power and that authority and the authority of the state, the power of the state, is the only thing that sort of ensures anything resembling a human right. And he makes a good point, because ultimately human rights, the way that we think of rights, only exist if there's a consequence to somebody infringing upon these rights. So we think about our own freedom and liberties in the United States. These things only exist because the United States is powerful enough to retain our autonomy. And obviously you could say, well, we're not really free today, and you're probably right. However, in theory, the only way that you can preserve liberty, preserve your own autonomy, is by having the power to defend it yourself, or by depending on the power of a sovereign. So for example, in Greece, that might have been your city-state. That might have been your tribe if you were still in a tribal society, your clan, your other family members. Power was the only thing that dictated being able to retain autonomy, a sort of Leviathan of sorts. And you could think of that as the early idea of the Leviathan before you sort of have the modern conception of the state. And it's important to distinguish that man in his natural setting is not peaceful, that he is warlike. And this is something that Oswald Spengler talks about in Man and Technics, a book that we'll be covering in a future video real soon. And Spengler talks about the human composition of the body man is constructed to be a predator. See, predators' eyes are fixed forward. They are fixed to look and find a target, to seek it and kill it when hunting. We also work together to hunt. And in this sense, we are very much predators, though we are omnivores. And when you look at the construction of the human body and you look in comparison to prey animals, for example, prey animals generally have their eyes more sideways because they're not seeking out targets. They're not seeking out animals to kill. They're looking to the side for threats, for predators sneaking up on them, so they are prepared to run away. And this also can be seen in how the predator, the predator baby, the offspring of predator grow compared to the prey. From birth, the prey are equipped to be able to run away from threats. A baby gazelle, pretty much hours after being born, can start walking and start running because it must be prepared to escape from predators upon birth. Whereas cubs of lions or puppies of dogs or of wolves or even human babies develop more slowly, like a kitten, for example. It takes like potentially weeks before it can open its eyes because they don't have that same threat. See, because they are predators, they seek out. They don't have to run away generally. And of course, there's variations. There's a food chain. Some predators are below others, but generally, the babies and the offspring of predators grow more slowly over time because they are predators, right? They don't need to be sort of born to run away from birth because generally their parents can take care of them. And I think it's really interesting that Spengler points out this distinction between primordial man in reality and the primordial man as sort of idealized with a lot of your humanists of like the 19th century. It's just not a real portrayal of how humans actually are. Humans are very brutal. And even before you get custom and you have culture, right, and you have possession, you have property, even before this, the sort of proto-humans are very warlike. If you look at evolution and you look at one of our closest kin, which is the chimpanzee, I was watching this documentary a year or two ago called Chimp Empire, and you have all-out wars between different rival chimp clans. These are chimp clans going to war, fighting over territory, fighting over hunting grounds, grazing grounds to pick fruit and whatnot. They fight for power. This is not something that is constructed through culture or constructed through the idea of property. This sort of precedes human existence, and this is also true of many other animals. In the savannas of Africa, you have lions contending against leopards, against hyenas, against wild African dogs or African wild dogs, jackals, more specifically with the social animals. So the lions, the hyenas, the jackals, the dogs, they literally fight pack wars, right? Like you'll see like 10 lions fighting against like 50 hyenas. War is something sort of that precedes culture, precedes custom, precedes civilization. So I think Rousseau's portrayal of primordial man is incredibly naive and just plain wrong, and that Hobbes, for the most part, does get it right in his portrayal of man of nature. Men are simply a reflection of nature, and we can be very brutal because we are animals after all. In the state of nature, we are brutal. We are brutal afterwards as well. If anything, civilization sort of numbs and castrates. And I guess in a way, this kind of goes with Hobbes' view of the state and can come to very bad conclusions. You could end up with a castrated man that you see in Fight Club, for example. A man that is defined by his economic contribution, by his material identity. This is something man doesn't want. Hannah Arendt talks about this. Man does not want to be defined by the material. So in a lot of ways, the state and modern consumer society castrates man. It puts them in this neurosis and catatonia where they don't want to act upon their inner violence and aggression, that animalistic tendency, because it's been subdued with comforts, with the sort of luxuries of modern society. You have stimulants like porn, which sort of take away from a man's natural urge to have real sex. You have all these processed foods. There's no point to hunt if you have all this high-calorie processed food at easy access, even shelter, all right? Having space and property. It's hard to own nowadays, but generally everybody has roof over their heads, at least in the developed world. And all these things sort of work to castrate us. And this is not me dogging on civilization. It's simply saying that sort of castrating man can lead to this neurosis that is very negative, and it leads to this very subdued man, sort of Nietzsche's last man, who is indifferent to the world and lives only for comforts and the sort of samsara, this will to life, this cycle of desire and wanting more always, never being satisfied. Man is brutal. If you look at the sack of Troy after the Trojan War and the Iliad, babies are thrown against walls, women are raped, people are killed, the city is burned. If you look at the founding of Rome, after Romulus kills his brother Remus to become the sole leader of Rome, he has this plan where they invite all these sort of local tribes, men, to come to a party in Rome, and while they're coming to the party, they sneak behind them and they attack their villages and steal their women. It's called the rape of the Sabine women. And the Sabines end up becoming a part of Rome. But they take all these Sabine women, these young women, and they force them to be their wives. Life is brutal. Life is an arena of competing wills. It's a struggle. It's a war. Nature is war. And because life reflects nature, ultimately, even with civilization, even with culture and custom and property, we end up having war again. So this sort of Marxist, naive point of view that it is only our constructions through culture and through unnecessary hierarchy and property, if you got rid of all that, people would just, become peaceful and everything would be fine. It's very naive and something I completely disagree with. I think that man is inherently warlike, and if anything, through property and through comfort and through all these sort of commodities of modernity, man is actually castrated of that energy. And this is not endorsing modernity, and this is not endorsing civilization. I think it's a very bad thing when you castrate man. Man's natural urges, their natural depression even, violence, wanting more, these are the things that lead to the conquering of new lands. This is what leads to people exploring new lands. This is what leads to civilizations being born, empires being forged out of fire. This is what leads to us eventually colonizing Mars and exploring space. These are good instincts that we should act upon. So what I want you to get out of this video is that ultimately it is in our DNA to be warlike. Man was not peaceful before we had things like property and custom and culture and civilization. War precedes human existence. War is the sole sort of a priori of life. Life is war. Nature is war. Nature is a struggle of competing wills, whether it's the plant, whether it's an insect, whether it's any sort of animal. There's a great documentary of this. I think he's a German, I could be wrong, maybe a German or a Dutch explorer who goes deep into the Amazon. And he talks about how life is this painful cycle of suffering in the jungle, and how it's a constant pain for certain organisms, even plants. I think he mentioned were in pain or something, I don't know. But he also talks about that's beautiful, right? There's a beauty to that struggle. And that's exactly the reason I don't believe in a civilization that castrates man of his natural animalistic urges. All beauty comes from some sort of struggle, some sort of competition. And when you just sort of put everyone in a neurosis, you over-medicate them to be these sort of mindless drones, they don't have a will to create beautiful art anymore. Why create beautiful art if everything is perfect? And this is sort of the end state of sort of modern civilization, the castration of man, this sort of hyper-materialistic being that has no purpose, that has no meaning. So I think, like I said, what I want you to get out of this is to know man was not peaceful before. Man is naturally warlike, but that's a good thing. And that's not something that we should shy away from. If anything, all these sort of sporadic acts of violence, I think, come about because we don't have a natural means of expressing our natural, healthy, violent energy. Something like jiu-jitsu is really good for that, right? It's hard to see a grudge when people can just duke it out, fighting. This is, I think, why men historically get along better than women, is because if men have a problem, they confront each other head on, they even fight over it. And I think it's a very good thing, whereas women kind of have this sort of backdoor approach, gossiping, sort of talking behind each other's backs. And of course, it's not the case of all women, but largely more so the case than men, at least, right, historically. So ultimately, man is warlike. Man does seek to dominate life, right, whether that's in the state of nature or even in civilization, right? And I think that's a healthy instinct that we need to sort of cultivate and even act on. And act on in a way that is obviously constructive. Like, you shouldn't just go beat up a bunch of people, right? But seeking war, whether that war is real war, or whether that war is colonizing Mars, creating the next great invention that really is a true feat of human innovation, not just like Amazon or Facebook that are sort of methods of consumption, but real thing that propels us higher, that propels us to the stars, that acts on our Faustian and Promethean ambitions towards the infinite, a will to the infinite, right? So that's sort of what I wanted to say in this sort of quick video, that nature is a state of war, and nature is constant struggle between all these organisms, just fighting to survive, and beyond that, fighting for power, fighting to not just survive but thrive, to be above all others, right? That's sort of the end state. That's why we evolve. We evolve not just because we want to live and survive, but because we want to be better, right? That's why we reproduce. We hope that our children will have a better life than we do. We want to build the future. We want to be a part of the future by starting our bloodlines and having as many kids as possible, so that they start as many bloodlines, so that our line lives forever. And that's sort of a sort of immortality in a sense, right? So that's what I'll leave you with, and I will be doing a video on Man and Technics by Spengler specifically, which will partially go over some of the things I talked about now and much more. So as always, thank you for watching, and this is The Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the warrior philosophy. We'll see you next time.